Look at the sky tonight. If you can see it from where you are, look at how vast it seems, how indifferent. Now imagine being a god who helped create that sky, watching as everything beneath it drowns, watching the world you shaped disappear under black water. That is what happened, according to texts carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. The Sumerians left us the oldest written records of a great flood. But what makes their version different from almost every other flood story you've heard isn't what happened to humanity. It is what happened to the gods themselves, the Anunnaki, the divine beings who supposedly created us, ruled over us, and then decided to destroy us. Because during the deluge they unleashed, something unexpected happened. The gods panicked. They suffered. They wept. They cowered like frightened animals while creation drowned beneath them. And for the first time in any ancient literature, we see divine beings confronting the consequences of their own decisions with something that looks remarkably like regret. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. This mystery has waited 4,000 years. It can wait a few more hours. Subscribe and stick around. To understand what happened during the flood, we need to understand what came before it. The Atrahasis epic, written around 1700 BCE but preserving much older oral traditions, tells us that the gods did not always have humans to serve them. In the beginning, there were only the Anunnaki, the great gods, and the Igigi, the lesser gods who performed all the physical labor. For 3,600 years, the Igigi dug the Tigris and Euphrates riverbeds. They cleared channels, built irrigation systems, maintained the infrastructure that made civilization possible. The texts are explicit about this. The gods themselves did the work. And according to the tablets, after 3,600 years of endless labor, they had enough. The Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools and surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the supreme god, demanding relief from their burden. The tablet describes Enlil's reaction. His face turned sallow as a tamarisk. The king of the gods was afraid of his own divine workforce. So the gods held a council, and they made a decision that would change everything. They would create humans, a new species designed specifically to bear the workload, to assume the drudgery of the gods. The birth goddess Mami, also called Nintu, mixed clay with the blood of a slaughtered god named We-I-La. From that mixture, 14 humans emerged. 7 male, 7 female, made to serve, made to work, made to free the gods from labor forever. But here is the detail that makes this creation story so different from many others. The texts say that the spirit of the slaughtered god, the Atemu, remained within humanity. We carry something divine inside us, not as a gift, but as a byproduct. The blood of a god mixed into our clay. It would become important later when the gods tried to destroy what they had made. Humanity did exactly what it was designed to do. We worked, we built, we multiplied. The cities grew: Eridu, Bad, Tibera, Larak, Sippa, Shurapak. Generation after generation, the human population expanded. And this is where the trouble started. Because humans, unlike the Igigi who had served before us, were apparently very loud. The texts are specific about this. The country became as noisy as a bellowing bull, and in the cosmic hierarchy of Sumerian mythology, Enlil, Lord of the Wind and Earth, could not sleep. The noise of humanity rose up to heaven and disturbed the rest of the gods. It sounds almost absurd when you say it plainly. The gods wanted to destroy humanity because we were too loud, but the Atrahasis epic takes this premise seriously. Enlil's first attempt was plague. He sent the god Namtar to spread disease among humans. But the wise priest Atrahasis appealed to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters, who lived in the depths below the earth. Enki advised Atrahasis to concentrate all prayers and offerings on Namtar alone. Embarrassed by this unexpected devotion, Namtar relented. 1,200 years passed. Humanity recovered. The noise returned. Enlil tried again, this time with drought. He commanded Adad, the storm god, to withhold rain. The harvests failed. Famine spread, but again Enki intervened, advising Atrahasis to direct all worship toward Adad. And again, the embarrassed god relented. The rains returned. Humanity survived. Another 1,200 years. Another population boom. Another noise complaint from the heavens. This time Enlil was determined. He called a council of all the Anunnaki. He bound them by oath, and he decreed something unprecedented. A flood would come. Not a natural disaster, but a deliberate divine execution. Every human on earth would die. And here is where it gets complicated. Enlil made Enki swear an oath. The god of wisdom who had saved humanity before would not be allowed to warn them this time. All the gods touched their throats in the ancient gesture of binding. Anyone who broke the oath would be beheaded. The decision was final. The command of the assembly could not be revoked, but Enki was the crafty god, the trickster of the Mesopotamian pantheon. He found a loophole that would echo through religious literature for millennia. He could not speak to a human. The oath was clear, but the oath said nothing about speaking to a wall. The text described what happened next with remarkable precision. Enki approached the reed hut where Atrahasis slept, and he spoke not to the man inside, but to the wall itself. "Wall, listen to me," he said. "Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Flee the house, build a boat, forsake possessions and save life." Technically, Enki had not broken his oath. He had warned the wall. If Atrahasis happened to be on the other side, well, that was simply a coincidence. The divine lawyers of ancient Mesopotamia had found their precedent. Sometimes the most important communications happen through intermediaries. Sometimes saving the world means talking to furniture. Atrahasis assembled the elders. He told them his god had expelled him from the land. He could no longer live in their city or set foot on the earth of Enlil. He would dwell with Enki in the depths. What he didn't tell them was that he was building an ark. Carpenters carried their axes. Reed workers brought their tools. The rich carried pitch. The poor brought whatever materials they could find. The boat took shape. Enki's instructions were specific. It should be roofed over so the sun could not see inside. The gear should be strong. The pitch should be firm. The vessel would need to withstand something unprecedented. Not just a storm, not just a flood, but the deliberate fury of every god in heaven except one. Atrahasis loaded the boat. Pure animals he slaughtered first, making final sacrifices. Fat animals he killed and brought on board as provisions. Birds flying in the heavens, cattle and creatures of the steppe. His family was brought on board. The text says he held a feast for his people. Some ate, some drank, but Atrahasis could not sit, could not rest. His heart was broken. He was retching bile, because he knew what was coming. He knew what the gods had planned. And as he sealed the door of the boat with bitumen, as he prepared for what no human had ever experienced, something was happening in heaven that the texts describe with haunting detail. The gods were gathering for what they thought would be a moment of triumph. Enlil had convinced them all. The noise would finally end. The interruption to divine sleep would cease. Humanity, that experiment that had grown beyond control, would be wiped clean from the earth. Every god had touched their throat and sworn the oath. Even Enki, who had saved humans before, had been forced to comply. Or so they thought. What none of them understood yet was that Enki had found his loophole. What none of them anticipated was that the flood they were about to unleash would teach them something they had never learned in all their ages of existence. They were about to discover what it felt like to be helpless, to watch something they had started grow beyond their control. The weather changed. The outlook transformed. Adad began to thunder, and then the flood came. The descriptions in the ancient texts are among the most vivid passages in all Mesopotamian literature. The deluge bellowed like a bull. The wind resounded like a screaming eagle. The darkness was total. There was no sun. The south wind blew rapidly, submerging the mountains in water, overwhelming the people like an attack. No one could see anyone else. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. Think about that description for a moment. Not just the scale of the destruction, but the sensory experience, total darkness, the sound of wind screaming like an eagle, water bellowing like a bull, people stumbling past each other in the blackness, unable to recognize their own families. The end of the world didn't come with fire from heaven. It came with water that erased all distinction between earth and sky. The Gilgamesh version adds a detail that the Atrahasis epic doesn't emphasize. The Anunnaki gods lit up the land with their lightning. Their bolts illuminated the destruction, giving the gods brief glimpses of what they had unleashed. Each flash revealed more horror, more drowning, more of their creation disappearing beneath the waters. All of humanity except those on the boat drowned. The texts use a haunting image. The dead bodies filled the rivers like dragonflies. They clogged the waterways like fish spawn in the sea. Everything the gods had created, everything humans had built over thousands of years, gone in 7 days of unrelenting storm. But here is where the Sumerian flood story diverges from almost every other version you've heard, because the texts don't just describe what happened to humanity, they describe in remarkable detail what happened to the gods themselves. And what happened was something none of them expected. The gods were frightened by the flood. Think about that for a moment. The beings who ordered the deluge, who planned it, who swore oaths to ensure it would happen, were terrified by what they had unleashed. The texts say they retreated, ascending to the heaven of Anu, the highest realm of the cosmic hierarchy. They fled upward, as far as they could go, and then comes one of the most striking images in all ancient literature. The gods were cowering like dogs, crouching by the outer wall. The Anunnaki, the great gods who had created humanity, and then condemned us to death, were reduced to whimpering animals, pressed against the edges of heaven, too frightened to look down at what they had done. Try to picture this scene as the ancient storytellers imagined it. The highest realm of existence, the heaven of Anu, where the gods dwelt in eternal splendor, had become a refuge for terrified deities. They had fled as high as cosmic geography would allow, and still the storm raged below them, still the waters rose, still their creation drowned. The texts are explicit about their physical condition. They were parched, they were famished, without humans to tend the temples, to offer sacrifices, to pour libations and burn incense. The gods were experiencing something unprecedented. Hunger, thirst, the sensation of need that they had created humans to prevent. Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. The sweet-voiced mistress of the gods wailed aloud. "The olden days have turned to clay," she cried, "because I said evil things in the assembly of the gods." How could I say evil things in the assembly of the gods, ordering a catastrophe to destroy my people? No sooner have I given birth to my dear people than they fill the sea like so many fish. The Anunnaki wept with her. The gods humbly sat weeping, sobbing with grief. Their lips were burning, parched with thirst, because here is what none of them had considered when they planned the flood. Without humans, there would be no one to bring sacrifices, no one to offer food and drink to the divine, no one to maintain the temples or perform the rituals that sustained the gods. The mother goddess Nintu suffered most visibly. The texts describe her lips becoming encrusted with rime. The great gods, the Anunna, stayed parched and famished. From hunger they were suffering cramp. The goddess who had created humanity from clay was now surfeited with grief, and she longed for beer in vain. There is something almost darkly comic about this detail. The gods who had decided to annihilate humanity for being too noisy now discovered they couldn't live without us. Like sheep, they could only fill their windpipes with bleating. They had destroyed their own food supply. They had killed the only beings who knew how to serve them. For 6 days and 6 nights, the flood raged. For 6 days and 6 nights, the gods suffered in heaven while humanity drowned below. They watched, they wept, they remembered. Perhaps for the first time, that their creation had value beyond the work it performed. They had destroyed something irreplaceable. On the 7th day, the storm subsided. The sea grew quiet. The tempest was still. The flood ceased. When Utnapishtim, as the hero is called in the Gilgamesh version, opened a hatch on his boat, light fell on his face. He looked out at a world transformed. The terrain was as flat as a rooftop. All humanity had turned to clay. In the Sumerian version, the hero is called Ziusudra, which means life of distant days. He was not just a wise man, but a king and a priest, someone who stood at the intersection of human and divine authority. When Enki spoke to the wall, when the warning came through indirect channels, Ziusudra understood. He had spent his life interpreting divine signs. This was the most important one he would ever receive. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest version of the Sumerian flood story, describes what happened after the waters receded. Ziusudra stepped up before the sun god Utu, kissing the ground before him. He sacrificed oxen and offered sheep. And then something remarkable happened. And Enlil, the very gods who had ordered humanity's destruction, honored him. They granted him breath eternal. Life like a god's descended into him, and they sent him to live in Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world, where the sun rises. The man who had preserved humanity's seed was rewarded with the one thing normally reserved for the divine themselves, immortality. He fell to his knees and sat weeping, tears streaming down his face. He looked for coastlines on the horizon and saw only water in every direction. The boat had come to rest on a mountain, held fast by the peak of Nisir, or Nimush in some versions. For 7 days more it sat there, unable to move, while the waters slowly receded. Then came the test. Utnapishtim released a dove. It flew away, but finding no resting place, it returned to the boat. He released a swallow. It too came back, unable to find land. Finally he released a raven. It ate, it scratched, it bobbed on the water. It did not return. Somewhere out there, dry land was emerging. Utnapishtim descended from the boat and did something the starving gods had been waiting 7 days to experience. He made a sacrifice. He offered incense at a mountainside altar. He placed 14 sacrificial vessels and poured reeds, cedar, and myrtle into the fire, and the smoke rose up to heaven. Imagine being one of those gods. For 7 days you have watched your creation drown. For 7 days you have suffered hunger and thirst that you had never experienced before. For 7 days you have cowered at the edge of existence, terrified by the very forces you thought you controlled. And now finally, the smell of burning cedar and roasting meat rises toward you. The gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor, and the text uses an image that reveals everything about the changed relationship between divine and human. The gods gathered like flies over a sheep sacrifice, like flies the beings who had ruled the cosmos, who had created and destroyed at will, now swarmed desperately around the first offering they had received in 7 days. There is no dignity in that image, no majesty, no transcendence. These are hungry beings finally getting fed. These are thirsty beings finally receiving drink. The flood had reduced the gods of heaven to the status of insects, and they were grateful for it. They were grateful simply to eat. Then Ishtar arrived. She lifted up the great jewels which Anu had made for her. The lapis lazuli necklace that was her most precious possession, and she made a vow that echoes through the ages. You gods, as surely as I shall not forget this lapis lazuli around my neck, may I be mindful of these days and never forget them. She declared that all the gods could come to the offering. But Enlil, who had ordered the flood, who had not considered the consequences, should not be allowed near, because without thinking, he had brought about the catastrophe and consigned her people to destruction. The mother of humanity was barring the father of destruction from her children's memorial, but Enlil came anyway. And when he saw the boat, when he realized that humans had survived his absolute decree, the text says he was filled with wrath. He swelled with anger at the other gods. Has any of these mortals escaped? He demanded. Not one was to survive the annihilation. His pride was wounded. His authority had been undermined. Ninurta, god of war, pointed the finger at Enki. Who else but EA could devise such a thing? Who else knew all things well enough to find a loophole in a divine oath? And then Enki spoke his defense, words that would resonate through religious thought for millennia, words that questioned whether absolute punishment is ever truly just. Wisest of gods, hero Enlil, how could you so senselessly bring down the flood? The text has Enki arguing, not that humans were innocent, but that the punishment was disproportionate. Lay upon the sinner his sin, lay upon the transgressor his transgression, punish him a little when he breaks loose, do not drive him too hard, or he perishes. This is one of the earliest recorded arguments for proportional justice in human literature. Enki isn't saying humanity didn't deserve punishment. He is saying the punishment exceeded the crime. Being noisy is not the same as being evil. Disturbing divine sleep is not a capital offense for an entire species. Would that a lion had ravaged mankind rather than the flood? Would that a wolf had ravaged mankind rather than the flood? Would that famine had wasted the world rather than the flood? Would that pestilence had wasted mankind rather than the flood selective punishment? Enki argued would have been more just than universal annihilation. Think about what Enki is really saying here. A lion kills some humans, but leaves the species intact. A wolf takes the weak, but the strong survive. Famine reduces population, but allows recovery. Pestilence strikes randomly, but eventually ends. All of these would have solved Enlil's noise problem without destroying everything the gods needed to survive. And here is what makes this text so remarkable. Enlil listened. The supreme god who had ordered genocide, who had nearly destroyed his own divine food supply, who had watched his fellow gods cower like dogs while his plan exceeded all control, actually reconsidered. The flood had taught him something about the limits of absolute power. Enlil went up into the boat. He took Utnapishtim by the hand. He brought his wife aboard and had her kneel beside her husband. Standing between them, he touched their foreheads and blessed them. Formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, he declared. But now he and his wife have become gods like us. Let them reside far away, at the mouth of the rivers. The flood hero and his wife were granted immortality, not as a reward for obedience, but as recognition that they had preserved something precious. They would live at the edge of the world, in the legendary land where the sun rises, forever separate from both gods and the humanity that would eventually repopulate the earth. But the gods did not forget the lesson of the flood. They made changes. The text describes how Enki and Ninchu, the birth goddess, established new rules for humanity. Death would come to all people. No one would live forever, except those specially chosen. This was new. Before the flood, the antediluvian kings had reigned for tens of thousands of years. Now human lifespans would be limited. This is a profound theological shift. The gods were establishing a system of population control that didn't require catastrophic intervention. Instead of another flood when humanity became too numerous, death itself would regulate human numbers. Each generation would replace the last. The noise would remain constant rather than growing endlessly, and there would be other limits on human reproduction. The texts describe the establishment of various classes of priestesses who would remain celibate, the institution of infant mortality, complications in childbirth. The gods had learned that unchecked human population growth led to problems, but rather than another flood, they would implement controls. Some scholars have interpreted these passages as ancient attempts to explain suffering. Why do children die? Why do some women never bear children? Why is childbirth dangerous? The Atrahasis epic provides an answer rooted in divine policy, rather than random cruelty. These were deliberate measures, implemented by beings who had learned from their catastrophic mistake. Think about what this narrative is actually saying. The gods made a terrible decision. They suffered the consequences of that decision. They learned from their mistake, and they changed their approach. This is not a story of divine perfection. This is a story of divine learning, of gods who are powerful but not omniscient, capable of error, and remarkably capable of regret. The scribes who preserved these texts for us lived in a world where the gods were understood to be real but not infallible, where divine beings had emotions, made mistakes, and sometimes hurt most those they had created. The Mesopotamian cosmos was not a place of perfect justice administered by perfect judges. It was complicated. Modern scholars have studied these flood narratives for over a century. The tablets themselves date from various periods, the oldest complete version of the Atrahasis epic coming from around 1650 BCE during the reign of the Babylonian king Ammi-Saduqa. But the stories are certainly older, preserved through oral tradition before being committed to clay. What strikes many researchers is the psychological complexity of the divine characters. These are not one-dimensional powers dispensing judgment from on high. Enlil is petulant, vindictive, but ultimately teachable. Enki is clever, compassionate, willing to bend rules for mercy. Ishtar is grief, stricken, maternal, devoted to the humans she helped create. Nintu suffers physically alongside her spiritual children. Some scholars have noted that the flood story may preserve cultural memory of actual flooding events. The Tigris and Euphrates were prone to devastating floods in ancient times. Archaeological evidence from Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero, shows layers of flood sediment radiocarbon dated to around 2900 BCE. Perhaps a particularly catastrophic flood was interpreted through religious lens. But whether the flood was historical or mythological, what matters for our purposes is what the story reveals about ancient understanding of divine-human relationships. The gods needed humans, not just for labor, but for sustenance. The sacrificial system was not merely ritual, it was cosmic economics. And when that system was interrupted, even briefly, the consequences reached to the highest heavens. There is a detail in the Atrahasis epic that later editors of the Gilgamesh version removed, perhaps finding it too raw. The original text describes the Anunnaki sitting in thirst and hunger during the flood. The later version changes this to simply the gods feared the deluge. The idea that divine beings could experience physical want was apparently uncomfortable for later theologians. This editorial process tells us something important about how religious ideas evolved in ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest versions of the flood story were frank about divine vulnerability. The gods needed humans. They suffered when deprived of sacrifice. They were capable of making catastrophic mistakes. But as time passed, as theology became more sophisticated, these raw admissions were softened. Similarly, the line about Nintu longing for beer in vain was omitted from later versions. The mother goddess reduced to desperate craving for the everyday drink that humans had always provided. It was too human a weakness for gods who were supposed to be transcendent, but the original texts preserved that vulnerability they wanted us to know. Beer in Mesopotamia was not just a beverage. It was a sacred substance offered to the gods in every temple. The goddess longing for beer is the goddess longing for worship, for connection, for the relationship that humans had always provided. When the flood killed humanity, it severed that connection. The gods discovered they were lonely. What does it mean that the oldest flood stories describe gods who suffer alongside their creation, who panic when their plans exceed their control, who discover, in the midst of destruction, that they cannot live without the beings they were trying to destroy? These are not questions with easy answers. They are invitations to contemplation. The Sumerian flood myth was deeply influential. It shaped the Babylonian versions that followed. It influenced the Hebrew scriptures, where Noah builds his ark and survives a flood sent by a god who, like Enlil, regrets the destruction and promises never to flood the earth again. The rainbow as divine reminder, the covenant as cosmic contract. These elements have their roots in Mesopotamian soil. Scholars have traced the transmission of flood narratives across cultures and centuries. The Babylonian version in the Epic of Gilgamesh preserved the essential elements while adding literary sophistication. The biblical account simplified the divine drama into a single deity, but maintained the theme of divine regret and cosmic covenant. But in the biblical version, God's regret is more theological. He grieves over human wickedness before the flood, not over the consequences afterward. The Hebrew text removes most of the divine vulnerability that makes the Mesopotamian version so striking. There is one God, not many, and that God does not cower like a dog or thirst for beer. Yet, even in Genesis, echoes of the older story remain. God smells the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice after the flood. God promises never to destroy the earth with water again. God establishes a covenant, a contract between divine and human. These are the same elements found in the Atrahasis epic, translated into a different theological framework. The Greek flood myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Hindu story of Manu, the countless flood narratives from cultures around the world, all may trace their ancestry to these Sumerian clay tablets. Or perhaps they remember independent catastrophes, separate floods in separate lands. The truth is probably some combination of both. What remains consistent across most versions is the idea that a flood represents a reset, a chance for the world to begin again. The antediluvian era, the time before the waters, becomes a golden age or a corrupted paradise, depending on the telling the post-diluvian world. Our world is something different, something tempered by catastrophe. In the Sumerian king list, the reigns of kings after the flood are dramatically shorter than those before. Where Alalim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years before the waters, the post-diluvian kings ruled for centuries, then decades, then historical time frames we can verify. The flood marked the transition from mythic time to human time. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of the story. The flood was not just a punishment for noise or a correction for overpopulation. It was the moment when gods and humans both discovered their limits, when the divine learned that creation has consequences, when humanity learned that survival requires more than obedience. Atrahasis means exceedingly wise. It is a title earned through experience, not granted at birth. The flood hero became wise, not because he obeyed a divine command, but because he understood what Enki was really saying when the god spoke to the wall. Sometimes the most important messages are delivered indirectly. Sometimes survival requires reading between the lines, and perhaps most importantly, sometimes the beings we think of as all powerful are capable of being surprised by their own actions, capable of learning, capable of changing. The gods of ancient Sumer were not perfect. They were, in their own way, still growing, still discovering what it meant to be responsible for a world they had made. There is a passage in the Atrahasis epic that deserves special attention. When the flood was at its worst, when the darkness was total and the waters had risen over the mountains, the text describes what happened in heaven with devastating simplicity. The great gods, the Anunnaki, stayed parched and famished. The goddess watched and wept, watched and wept. These 4 words contain the entire tragedy of the flood. From the divine perspective, the gods could see what was happening. They could not stop it. They had set forces in motion that exceeded their control, and all they could do was watch the consequences unfold. Watch and weep. Think about that detail one more time. The gods cowered like dogs. They pressed themselves against the outer wall of heaven, whimpering, while the flood they had ordered swept away everything below. They had created a force they could not control. They had unleashed destruction they could not undo, and for 7 days they suffered with their creation. There is something almost comforting in that image, not in the suffering itself, but in what it implies. If even the gods can make mistakes, if even divine beings can regret their decisions, then perhaps the universe is not as coldly indifferent as it sometimes seems. Perhaps somewhere, somehow, there is accountability even at the highest levels. The Sumerian scribes who carved these stories into clay tablets were not naive. They knew the world was harsh. They had seen floods and famines and plagues. They had watched children die and cities fall, but they believed, or perhaps they hoped, that even the gods learned from catastrophe. Even the cosmic order could improve. 4,000 years later, we still read their words. We still wonder at their images, gods gathering like flies over sacrifice. Ishtar clutching her lapis lazuli, vowing never to forget. Enki speaking to a wall while a man listens on the other side. The flood roaring like a bull, screaming like an eagle, turning the world to clay. If you've drifted off during this exploration, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here. The tablets will still hold their secrets. The questions they raise about divine responsibility, about cosmic justice, about what happens when power exceeds wisdom will continue to echo through human thought. But, if you are still awake, consider this. The oldest written records of a great flood don't just tell us what happened to humanity. They tell us what happened to the gods who caused it. They show us divine beings confronting the consequences of their own creation. Weeping, suffering, learning, and in the end, choosing to try again, to let humanity continue with limits, with controls, but continue. The flood was not the end of the story. It was the moment when gods and humans both understood that they were bound together. That creation is not a one-time act, but an ongoing relationship, that even divine decisions have consequences. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded what his ancestors had remembered for generations. The gods were frightened by the flood. They cowered like dogs, they wept, they learned, and then they blessed the survivors and promised to do better. That clay tablet is still here. You can see it in museums. You can read translations of its words. And 4,000 years after it was written, it still asks us to consider what it means when even the divine can be surprised by their own power, what it means to create something you cannot fully control, what it means to learn from catastrophe. Some modern interpreters have found in these texts an early recognition of what we might call the problem of power. The Anunnaki had the ability to destroy all of humanity, but having that ability did not mean using it was wise. The flood revealed that power without foresight leads to consequences even the powerful cannot escape. Others have seen in the flood narrative an ancient meditation on dependence. The gods created humans to serve them, but in creating servants, they also created a need. They became dependent on the beings they had made, and when they tried to destroy that dependence, they discovered it ran deeper than they knew. The waters receded. The boat came to rest. The sacrifice rose to heaven, and the gods who had destroyed almost everything discovered they could not exist alone. They needed us. We were not just labor. We were not just noise. We were something the cosmos required. That is what the Sumerian flood texts reveal about what the Anunnaki did during the great deluge they suffered. They regretted, they changed, and in doing so, they showed us something about the nature of power that we're still trying to understand 4,000 years later. Whatever you believe about gods and floods and ancient tablets, the story itself remains remarkable. A record of divine fallibility from an age when such admissions were rare. A portrait of cosmic beings learning from their mistakes. A reminder that even in the oldest written myths, the relationship between creator and created was complicated. Perhaps the ancient Sumerians understood something we sometimes forget, that power and wisdom are not the same thing, that the ability to destroy does not confer the ability to foresee consequences, that even those at the top of any hierarchy can be humbled by the results of their own decisions. The flood ended. Humanity continued. The gods kept watching from heaven, perhaps a little wiser, perhaps a little more humble, and somewhere in the cosmic distance, Ishtar still wears her lapis lazuli necklace, remembering the days when even divine beings discovered they were not truly omnipotent. Every culture that preserved a flood story was trying to understand catastrophe. Why do terrible things happen? Who is responsible? Can the world recover? The Sumerian answer was both comforting and unsettling. The gods caused it. The gods regretted it. The gods learned from it. Even the divine can make mistakes. If you are falling asleep now, let that image carry you into dreams. A goddess touching a blue stone at her throat. A promise never to forget. A world beginning again after catastrophe. and the strange comfort of knowing that even the gods had to learn what it meant to be responsible for something they loved. Thanks for spending this time exploring one of humanity's oldest mysteries. The tablets have waited 4,000 years for someone to read them. They can wait a few more hours while you rest. Subscribe and stick around. There is always another story waiting in the clay. Sleep well, and remember, even the gods learn to regret. Even divine beings discovered they could not live without the creatures they had made. In the oldest stories ever written, power and humility turned out to be closer than anyone expected. The flood taught everyone that lesson, even the Anunnaki,